Rothley was a manor. That means it's an area presided over by a lord of the manor who had the right to call people together into a manor court and have them regulate their property transactions in front of a steward of the manor. He also had the right to ask them to do a little bit of work for him, and he also had the right to receive tithes from them. So this place in the 18th century was a place that was where the lord of the manor was a Babington, and they exercised that lordship over this village and several other villages east of the River Soar. Rothley Court is now a hotel, and it was made into a hotel in the middle of the 20th century, but it all started back in the 13th century when King Henry III gave the manor and soak of Rothley to the Knights Templar. The reason they gave it to them was for them to be able to use it as a source of income to finance their work in the Holy Land. The Babington family, who were living across the water in Cossington, they bought it and they became the lords of the manor, and that started an 8-generation lordship of Babingtons. Thomas Babington went to St John's College, Cambridge, and a year later a man called Thomas Gisborne, who was the son of the Lord of the Manor of Yoxall in Staffordshire, came, and so did William Wilberforce. They all became chums. Wilberforce had the next room to Gisborne, and they became firm friends.
Well, Thomas Gisborne actually was at Cambridge with both Wilberforce and Babington, and he made friends with both of them. Although he lived a very different kind of life to Wilberforce, who was more out and about, outgoing and more social. But he also made friends with Babington, and actually he married Babington's sister Mary.
Wilberforce was very sociable, he was very affluent, he had a door open to visitors, and he gave a lovely Yorkshire pie to all his student friends. Both of them got on really well with Wilberforce and later on become very close, both professionally but also spiritually.
Because he went to Cambridge and had a proper liberal education, and because there were these other developments that were going on in the world, there was the famous essay that was written by Thomas Clarkson for a competition at Cambridge University, and the beginning of the formation of the committee to abolish the slave trade in London.
Is it lawful to enslave the unconsenting? That was effectively the title, and Clarkson read voraciously. He had a huge appetite for reading, and particularly in pursuit of an answer to this question, he read very widely. But the book that had the greatest impact on him was probably the work by somebody called Anthony Benezet, who was a Quaker, and he was sort of foremost in the sort of abolitionist movement at that time. That was the sort of springboard that led Clarkson to write his essay in Latin, as I say, and this had a huge impact on him. And it was whilst travelling back from Cambridge to London that he had what we call these days a Damascene moment, this revelation that who was actually going to right this wrong? You know, that clearly what his researches and what his essay had shown him, that this was wrong, that people were being treated like this, and that there was this trade in humanity. And it was at Wade's Mill in Hertfordshire that he had this moment and realised that, you know, if he didn't do something, then something wasn't going to be righted, you know. And from then on, you know, he was in the vanguard of the anti-slavery movement.
The transatlantic slave trade was the biggest forced human migration in human history, and it begins in the 15th century right through to the 19th century. So several hundred years this happens, and it involved the enslavement, forced migration of men, women and children from West Africa, but also central parts of Africa, who were transported on European ships across the Atlantic through what was called the Middle Passage.
It really began when the Portuguese, who had been exploring the coast of West Africa from the 1450s onwards, the Portuguese established a colony in what became Brazil in 1500. Prior to that, the Spanish had taken a few Africans across the Atlantic, but it had been in very small numbers and it hadn't been an organised system. But really, when the Portuguese got involved and began to establish plantations in Brazil, that's when you see the organised transatlantic slave trade starting.
It was a system that was run, managed and organised and sustained by European maritime powers, different nations such as Portugal and France, Holland, and later on Britain. And it was run purely for profit.
African labourers had already been used to grow sugar in places like Cyprus and Madeira and the Canary Islands, which had already been developed as sugar plantations. And so the Europeans had kind of practiced the system, if you like. They practiced the use of Africans as slaves on these plantations, saw that it could be really profitable, and so they decided to ship them in huge numbers across the Atlantic.
The transatlantic slave trade, for some people, based on whatever books you read, is the wrong terminology. Some people refer to it as a Holocaust. Some people refer to it as a massacre. Some people refer to it as various things. So the Atlantic slave trade, as it is termed, some people tend to feel should not really be, it's sort of watered down exactly what happened. It's a grab and raid process that had been going on. It wasn't a trade as such. It was a process where we were stolen, brutalized, grabbed by force. A trade means something freely taking place. So to give it a nice rounded terminology, transatlantic slave trade, as though we had treaties signed with the Africans, it wasn't like that.
We refer to the journey from Africa to the Americas as forced migration rather than the Middle Passage. Because if you think of it from the perspective of those African people involved, it's just the start of their journey. And it was only really for the Europeans involved that it's a middle part of their journey. So it's a very Eurocentric term to say Middle Passage. And also with forced migration, you're getting across that point that people didn't want to go. This was taken out of their hands. This wasn't their choice.
It was known as the triangular trade, which meant that European ships would transport products made in the UK, cheap products such as textiles and ceramics. They would then be sold, bartered for, in exchange for enslaved Africans on the West African coast. And those people were then in turn shipped to different parts of the Americas, so Brazil and Guyana in South America, places like South Carolina and Georgia in America, and Caribbean islands such as St. Kitts and Barbados and Jamaica.
When you really look at it, and you ask the average professor how many people were taken out of Africa and enslaved, they would say, oh, no more than 14 to 17 million at the most. Not true. It's over 140 million people. Now you may say, well, why am I saying 140 million people? What you've got to understand is before the enslavement of Africa, There was no black people in any of the Caribbean islands. That is Barbados, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Jamaica, or any of the other Caribbean islands that you care to mention. There was no black people in Cuba or any of the Latin American countries. The true people were Amerindians. They were like an Amazon Indian type of people that spread from the Amazon throughout the whole of the Caribbean into Latin America, possibly North America. Unfortunately for them, they were susceptible to the diseases of the Spanish and the Portuguese. It was a leading Roman Catholic Spanish bishop whose name was La Casa. He said we should not be using them as slaves, we should be using Africans. Africans are not human beings. They are the children of the devil. They are the sons and daughters of Ham. Ham, the son of Noah, was supposed to have seen his father's nakedness. Therefore, God was supposed to have cursed him and all his offspring. And that's supposed to be the reason why we are black. Therefore, by taking these black creatures and treating them harshly, we're doing nothing wrong. We're doing God's work.
Well, slavery really began in North and South America because the white settlers there needed labour, basically. So when they arrived in the 15th and 16th centuries, they anticipated using Native Americans as slave labour. They thought that they would make really good labourers in things like mining and sugar plantations. But what actually happened was the Europeans brought diseases with them, and Native Americans started dying off in huge numbers. In some areas, 90% of natives died in a very short period of time, just a few years.
When they talk about slavery, everybody thinks, oh, it was all done by the Americans. No such thing. There was no such thing as America. The first slave ship that ever arrived in America arrived in Jamestown, which was set up by the English. There was no such thing as America. It was all done by the English. And most of the English were Liverpool slave traders. More slave ships left Liverpool to be involved in the enslavement of Africans than any other European country. And that is a fact.
The British had started to trade slaves on a very, very small scale in the 16th century under Elizabeth I. She herself hated slavery, but she was pragmatic. She saw that other European countries were getting involved, so she thought, maybe I should let my English sailors try this out too. But the British really got involved properly in the transatlantic slave trade in kind of 1670s and 1680s, when Charles II permitted the establishment of a royal company called the Royal African Company that had a trading monopoly on taking slaves from the west coast of Africa to North America. And so the way I see the slave trade is that it kind of goes in different phases. To start with, the Portuguese really dominated, and they were the ones that were benefiting most from the slave trading. But then later on, other countries get involved, and really in the 18th century, it's the British who are doing most of the trading.
In 1789 and 1790, William Pitt had organised a select committee in Parliament. And the select committee was there to gather evidence about the slave trade and slavery. Because, you know, like you've already mentioned, there's no television, there's no email. Everything has to be done really by talking to people and saying, well, what's it like there? And so all this was written down on pieces of vellum. And we have a story that was in a letter from somebody who was present. In the summer of 1790, Wilberforce, Gisborne, Thomas Gisborne, his friend, and Thomas Babington went to Yoxall Lodge, Gisborne's house, and they spent the whole of the summer, 9 hours a day, working on the work of the Select Committee. They had 1,400 pages of vellum.
They worked a lot at Yoxall Lodge, and they scarcely emerged from the work working 9 hours a day. They would just stick at it. And they went through loads, about 400 folios, I think, of writings on the abolition.
Thomas Babington would read it, and they would suggest how they could boil it down Gisborne would write it down, and Wilberforce would agree what it was, and they boiled it down gradually. And then the same thing happened the next year with more evidence, and they came here. They came to this place. They came to Rothley Temple and worked on this evidence, and gradually and painstakingly built up the bones of the possible bill that could win support in Parliament.
Many other individuals were frantically gathering evidence. They were taking notes, pushing against the slavery of the day.
Wilberforce, the voice in Parliament. Clarkson was the great gatherer of information. He was the great gatherer of evidence. He gathered the petitions, he got the signatures, he got the movement, going in the country.
Back in 1792, the House of Commons, although it was persuaded that the slave trade was a bad thing, it couldn't bring itself to pass an act that was abolition now. So it had this massive compromise of saying gradual. That wasn't Wilberforce's wish, but it was the only thing that the Commons would agree to.
Some argue Wilberforce was not as brave and pushing the abolition of the slave trade in Parliament because of his concerns for William Pitt's political career.
These feisty women in Leicester, Susanna Watts and Elizabeth Hayrick, who thought, no, we're not going to have this, and they formed their own group, and they wanted immediate abolition, and they became very influential.
They basically found conscious consumerism, because the main product of the kind of slave colonies of Britain at this point is sugar, which is kind of then shipped into England, shipped all over the world, sold a lot, and consumed by virtually every household in England. And what they do is to try and make the practice of slavery unprofitable, to kind of cut off the profits, is they start going door to door all over the town, trying to convince people not to purchase slave-grown sugar and instead look at East Indian sugar, possibly, or just don't eat sugar altogether.
The more you read about Elizabeth Herrick, the more you realise that she was a very vital figure in the fight for the immediate abolition of slavery. A lot of the men were just saying, I think we better have gradual abolition, and as a Quaker she said, it's just an abomination, it has to go. And she fought through the female societies for the wording to be changed, that there will be a call for abolition of slavery.
If you read the poetry of women abolitionists, they would want immediate abolition rather than gradual, because they weren't in the political system. And you could argue that they had less political and social rights, so they had more, not connection, because their worlds were very different, but they could see the injustices more acutely than the landed gentry or the people in power, such as Wilberforce.
Wilberforce disapproved strongly of women. He thought they shouldn't get involved. And despite that, Elizabeth still managed to correspond with some of the major figures. And as I say, she was involved in Birmingham, where they founded the first women's anti-slavery society. And then that was April 1825. In June, she's founding one in Leicester. And I think the most influential thing they did was that they said that unless you change the wording and call for abolition, immediate abolition of slavery, we withdraw our funding. And of course the fundraising by the women's societies was very important to the movement.
They published a wonderful magazine called The Hummingbird, and they organised a massive boycott of West Indian sugar, so that people really knew what were the stakes.
We don't actually know how much effect the sugar boycott had,
but
we know that it had a good effect locally. We know that it was taken up very widely in Leicester. And if you look at Elizabeth Herrick's amazing pamphlet, Immediate Not Gradual Abolition, which is such a call to arms, it's a really fierce and heartfelt plea for us to properly recognise the plight of slaves, that really brings Rebecca's point home, how she's trying to make every individual conscious that the choices they make have a wider impact on the world. It's really a plea for individual responsibility for things which might be happening on the other side of the world, in a way which I think is still really relevant today, has a lot of resonance, I think.
And this is what she wrote. The detaining of our West Indian slaves in bondage is a continued acting of the same atrocious injustice which first kidnapped and tore them from their kindred and native soil and robbed them of that sacred, inalienable right which no considerations, how plausible soever, can justify the withholding. We have no right, on any pretext of expediency or pretended humanity, to say, because you have been made a slave and thereby degraded and debased, therefore I will continue to hold you in bondage until you acquire capacity to make right use of your liberty.
Public opinion was turning against the slave trade, that people were understanding on a weekly basis through newspapers about, and also what was very important was the actual narratives of the enslaved people. People forget that Equiano travelled around and about it and published his narrative, and to hear and actually see ex-enslaved people talking about their experiences humanised slavery, because they were very easy, even today, to see what's happening in Syria, because it's on the television. It's in a sense is removed from our reality. But if you're talking to somebody face to face and hearing their narratives, that pierced the soul of the public's imagination and hearts.
There was an election in 1806, and a whole new group of MPs came in, many of whom have had much more first-hand experience of the slave trade and slavery, being ex-soldiers or ex-colonial officials or ex-clergymen or doctors, and they were now in Parliament. And Lord Greville, who became the Prime Minister, he was a person who had been with William Pitt the Younger to persuade Wilberforce in the early days to take this cause up. And now he was the Prime Minister, even though he was in the House of Lords. And instead of putting it through the House of Commons, he put the bill through the House of Lords, and his persuasion won the day. So then it came to the House of Commons when it was successful.
My opinion on that is twofold. First of all, the whole abolitionist movement, I think, was a compromise, because first of all, when slavery was about to be abolished, it wasn't for humanitarian reasons. Slavery was coming to an end because slavery, as it was then, was no longer profitable. The whole sugar situation has started to subside. The Industrial Revolution starting to take place. Slave owners were starting to lose money on plantations. So crops weren't being sold. So a lot of things was happening around the time, which makes slavery as an economical output and non-economical viable situation. So yes, slavery was brought to an end primarily because of that, not because these abolitionists were waving flags and going to church and going in parliament. No. And even though these so-called men talking about abolishing slavery were wrong, why weren't they able to seek compensation for the slaves? How is it that you're campaigning for abolition of slavery, but the slaves get nothing and the masters get all the money? I mean, what kind of campaign is that?
When the slave trade was abolished, and then when slavery itself was abolished, all the emphasis went on abolition and how the British were very pleased with themselves, as they thought, for being the first people that had abolished both the trade and then the institution. So we wanted to bring the memory of slavery back into Britain and back into British history. And one way to do that is through the slave owners, because we realised that there were a large number of people in Britain who owned human property. They owned enslaved people. And mostly, when people in Britain think about slavery, they think about it as happening somewhere else. You know, it happened in the Caribbean, mainly. That's what they think about. Or it happened in the US. You know, it's something that doesn't connect with here. So by focusing on the slave owners, we can bring it right back into the heartlands of Britain. So we used as our way into this the compensation records. Because when slavery was abolished in 1833, £20 million was paid to the slave owners by the British government, that is to say, by British taxpayers. So we've documented all the people who made claims on the basis of their property in enslaved men, women and children for that money. And there were 47,000, roughly 47,000 individual claims, and about 3,500 of those come from people who were living in Britain. But despite the fact that it's a relatively small number in Britain, they got nearly half the money.
Reparations, man, that is the key word today. But I must say reparations in its entirety, a lot of people tend to believe reparations is about money. And I must go on the record and say reparations isn't about money. It is repairing the damages done to us as a people. That is what reparations is about. The broad definition, yes, it was cis one, so but as we as Caribbean people looking to promote reparations, it is the repairing of damage done to us. That is what we are fighting for. The money is a bonus. But when I speak to people in various circles and various places that I go out and give talks, the first thing they would say, well, that's a red herring. Europeans ain't gonna give you any money. We are not initially asking for money. No, we're asking for the Europeans to be brought to justice for the wickedness they did against us. That is what we are asking for first and foremost. The money is merely compensation. The money is not reparation. You must get this quite clear. People are confusing reparation with compensation. It's two separate things.
I would not want any money being given to any African or Caribbean government for the enslavement of our people. I want the money to go to the descendants of enslaved Africans wherever they are.
Let's put a scenario. You as an individual, living with your wife and your family, some intruders come in, tie you up, brutalize your wife repetitively, then end up brutalizing your children. But your children got to the point where enough is enough, and they found the courage and strength and the tenacity to then bring the abusers to justice. This is our generation of people. We have now found the courage and the tenacity to rise up and tell our oppressors, listen, you have brutalized us, and we are going to bring you to justice via the court. There's no word of mouth. So we have now, yes, so talking everything in one, we have now assert ourselves to the point where this generation is strong and assertive enough to say to the oppressor, we are going to take you to court for the wickedness you did to our foreparents and continue to do to us today. So it shows we are making progress. But a brother said last Saturday, let's not jump the gun, because the whole concept of reparations is very much in its embryonic stage. This is why people are thinking, well, we wouldn't get any money. So we are saying, yes, reparations today is in its, not even infancy. We are saying embryonic stage. The egg has just been planted in the womb.
What we're very much in favour of, which I think is now part of the CARICOM claim, is that a commission should be set up which would fully investigate this whole issue and see what possible ways there are of providing reparations for something which is, a human tragedy over generations. It's not something that ended in 1834, 1835. It's had repercussions long, long after. And that ought to be the subject for a serious investigation by all interested parties.
The full scale of the atrocities, therefore, of the slave experience has never been fully explored. So we have a lot of unresolved problems, psychosomatic problems related to slavery that have never been aired, that have never been given voice, that have never been discussed from the generation of 1838 up till now. So if you count that to be roughly 7 generations, you consider it like a building with 7 stories, 7 floors, but all based on a dodgy, bad foundation from the beginning. And instead of thinking with the first floor being built to resolve the problem of the foundation, instead what we have done is basically paper over that and build another floor on top of that. So what we have, metaphorically speaking, is a building that is becoming more and more precarious and uninhabitable as the generations roll by.
I did a talk last Saturday at the event in London, and I mentioned one of the repercussions of the so-called slave trade was post-traumatic slave syndrome. And I asked the question if anyone in the audience have ever heard of post-traumatic slave syndrome, and surprise, surprise, nobody ever heard about that. And post-traumatic slave syndrome is something we as a black people need to understand its connotations, what it stood for, what it represents, what it is, the impact it has had on us and still having on us today.
Because when you think about it, you can either take Birmingham, London, Manchester, Liverpool, just as a tiny example. And you get black children, young men and women there. And what are they involved in? Shooting each other, drugs, murder, rape, you name it.
If we as a black people don't understand our past in terms of what has happened to us, yes, they may have understand that bit of it, but if they don't understand today the repercussions of what happened to us in the past, where we now end up with post-traumatic slave syndrome, it's going to take us a very long time to understand why we are continuously in this cycle of deprivation, century after century after century. So post-traumatic slave syndrome is something that we as a black people need to understand its connotations, its effects, first of all, and the causes. And if we as a people don't understand that, we're going to take a long time to step out of this decadence.
Think of the sugar cane that we in the Caribbean were forced to grow. The sugar mill grinds the canes to a pulp. The sugar comes out the other end. What happened to us in this transatlantic slavery experience is Africans of different ethnic groups, Igbo, Yoruba, Hausa, Kanuri, Fulani, Mandinka, Wolof, Soninke, all were pressed into this grinding mill, and out the other end came Negroes. That is what has happened to us. And whilst that should be, we should find in that some way to unite for some reason because of the unresolved psychosomatic collective trauma, we have never been able to have a frank and honest discussion about our slavery experience. And maybe now, it may be that it is too late and we will forever remain orphans of history. I don't know.
If we have to be honest, we as African people in the Caribbean did most of the work towards the liberation of our people. And people like Olado Equiano as well, who was a slave who was a captive from Nigeria, who contributed immensely to the liberation of our people. We must also remember and not forget